Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Eurosport Snooker Commentator David Hendon. David, welcome to the Godcast. How are you?
I'm very well. Nice to be here.
David, when I was looking, doing my little bit of research and stuff, and I was looking through the snooker stuff. Lo and behold, it comes up that you are an established playwright, which is very interesting to read as somebody who's recently published a book. Just tell us a bit about that side of David Hendon that we might not be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, it was something I was always interested in, and I joined a writing group where I live in Birmingham, and we would meet in a pub. And the key word there is pub, really, because it became a bit of a sort of drinking thing. But they actually, during the course of our sort of run in this group, they actually built a theatre in the pub at the top, like 80 seats. And I thought that must be, that's kind of a sign almost, isn't it? That maybe, I'm in a venue now, and it hasn't opened yet, this theatre, so they haven't programmed it yet. I should actually maybe try and make something happen. So I'd written this play, and it was very deliberately for a small space, just two characters, no sort of set. And I literally just printed it off, went up the stairs to introduce myself to the guy called Ian who ran it. And he said, I'll read it and I'll let you know. And he read it and he said, yeah, we should put something on by a local writer. And they put it on. And I thought, wow, theatre's easy. You just write a play and hand it over. And I realized it wasn't quite as easy as that as we went on. But that was the start of it. And that play went to the Edinburgh Fringe. And when you see your own work, it inspires you to keep going and write more. So I wrote a few more and have done a few more there and in London and various places. So yeah, it's very different to the snooker world, but it's also very fulfilling when it sort of comes to fruition.
When you say it's fulfilling, David, what is the most fulfilling part? Is it the creative part of the process, or is it getting the commissioning, or is it the actual the feedback that you get from the person that's sat down and watched what you have written?
I think all of those really. I think the physical act of sitting down and writing it, because when you're writing it, no one else is involved. You are left to your own devices. And then it's interesting when other people do become involved, when you get a director and also the actors and the sort of stage manager, all those people who have their own ideas and their own views. And then you hand it over to the audience and you see what reaction they have. And I mean, for example, one of the plays I did in Edinburgh was a comedy, or at least it was most days. It was you building up, okay, the first laugh's coming. And sometimes it didn't come. You think, oh no, we're in trouble. But then later on, something that you didn't think was particularly funny gets a massive laugh. And that's just interesting to hear. That's the great thing about theatre, it is different every time. It's not like a film. The film has been made, it's on the screen, it's not going to change. The play can change. And in Edinburgh, what I noticed was quite often it was about like what the weather's like. If the weather was no good, then the audience reaction wasn't much good. But on a sunny day, people seemed happier. But so yeah, all of that really, and just the fact that you as you're watching it yourself, all the work that's got into it, not just by you but by everyone else who's involved. To see that come off and hopefully for it to be well received is great.
When I introduce you, David, I introduce you as Eurosport Snooker Commentator, but you might be fair of you to say, well, actually, I'm a little bit more than that because you're a journalist as well, aren't you? And where did that love of writing come from? Was it with you from a young age as a kid, or did it evolve as you got older?
Yeah, I was thinking about this actually. I think it started. We had a local library, and it was very much the sort of in a sitcom sort of stereotype of a library where if you spoke, you were shushed. There was a woman. I mean, I was only a kid, 6 or 7, and she would watch you like a hawk, because she thinks, oh, the kid's going to run around. And I think it instilled a certain reverence for words. I thought, oh, this must be important. You're not even allowed to speak in here. I mean, sadly, a lot of these libraries are closed now. But it's kind of miraculous. You could go around there, you could get sort of 6 books out, not pay anything for it, and start reading and enjoying language that way. I think sort of journalism always interested me because it seemed to be sort of about finding things out. And if you're curious about the world, you want to find things out. I never planned to become a snooker journalist, but I was always interested in snooker. So the two things just sort of collided, really, and I've had a very fortunate career.
Just tell people about that pathway for you, David. Did your love of writing lead you to do study that at college and university, or did you have a completely different pathway to begin with?
Yeah, I didn't really have any sort of plan or goal as such. I did English at university and came out, and every Monday in those days, because this was late 90s, so it was sort of pre-internet in terms of it being central to our lives. So I would get the Guardian every Monday, the Media Guardian job section, and it was full of jobs for graduates and people already established in the media, and you would scour it and you would apply for various jobs. And a few weeks after graduating, there was a job advertised at the WPBSA who ran professional snooker, a junior press officer, and it actually said suits a graduate with interest in snooker. And I thought, well, I'd always had an interest in snooker group in the 80s, where it was, you know, on all the channels, and still had that enjoyment. I still played, not too well, but I still played. So I applied for that one, and I got that job. So I was then working on the circuit, and, you know, was sort of had my foot in the door. But it wasn't, that was very much sort of the other side. It wasn't journalism, obviously. That was more PR. And I did that for about 18 months. Got to know the snooker media, people like Clive Everton and others. And Clive actually said to me, you know, if you ever sort of wanted to come and work for me, work in my agency, because he supplied sort of newspaper and radio reports to various outlets, you know, we're looking for someone. So I thought, after doing the job for 18 months, I thought, yeah, I would like to do that, actually, because it looks a lot of fun. And again, quite fortunate that opportunity came along. But that was the start of me doing journalism.
Can you remember, David, the first piece you wrote, snooker related?
Not really. I mean, it would have been, I suppose, a press release initially in the first, and then when I went freelance, because it depended on, like, I did sort of Scottish newspapers, so if Stephen Hendry or John Higgins or Alan McManus, those sort of guys were playing, I'd have to write about them. And some days they're all playing, so some days you'll be doing 6 or 7 stories. So the ones you've written, you just forget about, you know, straight away, because you're on to the next one. But it's quite exciting when you see your name for the first time in the newspaper. You know, that's quite an exciting thing, because there's a certain power, I think, to naming someone who's written a story. Yeah, I mean, they were again, though, it was a different time, because newspapers still then were very sort of powerful. And I think, obviously, in the age of online, they've lost that a little bit. And there's certainly, the budgets have been tightened a lot. So I think they use fewer sort of freelancers now. But at that time, it was a good time to get into it.
David, I love snooker. I think it's you know, a bit of a Marmite sport for some people, isn't it? But I really love snooker, and I was interested to listen to a radio discussion during the Olympics. They were talking about the decline of athletics as a sport, really, particularly the track and field events. Not so much the runners, but, you know, the discus and high jump and things like that. And they was talking about, you know, that this is a long-standing sport that just hasn't evolved and hasn't changed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the sport's in decline, does it? I mean, snooker hasn't changed its format really for as long as I can remember. What do you think it is that makes snooker so appealing to, you know, it's the same game in essence, isn't it? But each frame is different. What do you think it is?
I think in some ways it's the opposite to athletics, or sort of the sprint races, where, you know, it's over in 10 seconds. I think one of the things with snooker, because it goes on so long, and certainly the World Championship, I mean, that's 17 days and it's all day, every day. You get involved emotionally, I think. I think people sort of get to know the players. Obviously, they have their favourites and they root for certain people, but you get to know their stories. You know, you hear about some family tragedy maybe, or something in the background that's willing them on. And that's always been the case. It's always been about identifying with the people who play it. I think that the thing, I mean, we lost Ray Reardon recently. Now, his backstory was extraordinary. You know, he was buried as a minor. He was commended as a policeman, all before he turned professional. So he's got this vivid story that is relatable. And I think that's still the case. The game, there's a lot of money in the game, but it's not at ridiculous levels. So the guys who play it, they're still grounded, I think. And I think that fans watching still take to them as much to the sport itself. The game is the game, and it's kind of fascinating and a bit eccentric, and, you know, it's knocking balls into holes ultimately, if you're going to boil it down. But the sheer sort of mental effort that goes into it, I think people understand. And then you see when, for example, when Kyron Wilson won the World Championship, what it means to him and his family. You know, they all came out. His father, multiple sclerosis, you know, gone through a tough time, but they're all there together to celebrate. And I think people really take to that. And certainly, as I say, at the World Championship, when you sat and watched it for 17 days, you know, you get invested in it.
I remember bunking off school when the World Snooker Championship started, and I'd settle in at home without my parents knowing, wait till them to go to work, and settle into the early session, which I think used to start about 10:30. I think it's probably still quite similar, isn't it? Who were the guys in your early days, David, who you thought, wow, these guys have got the X factor?
Yeah, I mean, well, the one who seemed to me to be sort of almost from another planet was Steve Davis, just because he was so good. It's not only that he was a better player, he looked more sort of professional than everybody. I mean, he was obviously quite young, very always well turned out. Just the way he sort of nodded to the audience as he came out, he had the very sort of firm handshake, sip the water, all that stuff, impeccable. But obviously, it was a very vivid time. You had Alex Higgins and Jimmy White. You know, you had the sort of cleaner cut characters like Dennis Taylor, Terry Griffiths, Cliff Thorburn. They were like sort of friends almost, because they were always on. It was like a soap opera. It was the same cast in the 1980s, and every channel at some point showed it. BBC One at times would show it in prime time. Even Channel 4 for a while showed snooker. So those people, it was like, you know, putting on EastEnders and seeing Den and all those, you know, Angie and all those characters that you just knew, and you got to know them. And as I say, because it was on so much, you did feel like you knew them. But yeah, I think for me, like that, the Davis era, people got fed up of him winning, which was kind of understandable. And they supported Stephen Hendry when he came through, and then he won everything as well. But that's just because they were so good. And of course, Stephen very much modelled himself on Steve Davis.
Steve Davis was one of those players, wasn't he? That like you say, he ended up winning everything and became, I don't know if unpopular is the right word, but people, you know, whoever he was playing, it was usually they'd want the other person to win, wouldn't they? But as a sports person, as a competitor, he was quite fierce, wasn't he? Just say a bit about Steve Davis.
Yeah, I think he was the first player really to take the game really seriously as a profession. A lot of the other guys had other jobs beforehand, and you know they still did the things they did after work and a drink and a smoke and all that. Steve did none of that. He came through at the perfect time, really, in the late 70s. The circuit was just taking off. It was on just coming onto television properly. Of course, he met Barry Hearn, who was a driving force behind him as well. And Steve just did everything right, and he didn't have any other interests, so he could throw himself into snooker. But what he also did, which was very important, you're right, not everyone was a fan, but he did have very particular fans. My nan was a big fan of Steve because he was a good boy. You know, he did everything right. He brought in a different audience. He brought in a family audience. He brought in a middle class audience. Certain people who would disapprove of Alex Higgins and those characters loved Steve Davis, and he helped, because he was so reliable. He helped bring in sponsors. He helped bring money to the sport. I really think he is one of the, if not actually the most significant person in the history of the game, because at that time when it exploded on television, you need the bad boys and you need the colour, but they can't all be like that. You need also the reliable characters. And he was also very good at just shutting out all the noise and all the attention and just winning. You know, I mean, he's still to this day has won more trophies than anyone else in the game's history, all told. You know, in the 1980s, they said he was on TV more than Margaret Thatcher. He was probably the best known British sportsman of that decade. And there were some big hitters around at that time. He won the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, only snooker player to do that. He was a massive name. I remember we went down when I was a kid to Madame Tussauds in London. And I remember seeing the waxwork of Steve Davis. I took a picture of it because I was like, I'd never met Steve, but this was the next best thing. You know, he was very much, you know, a big, big name.
I often think, when you're watching the snooker on the telly, the conversation, who is the greatest player of all time, comes up, and I actually think the more interesting question is who is the second greatest player of all time, because I think generally people agree that it's Ronnie, isn't it? Who's the greatest? So, who is the second greatest snooker player of all time, then, David, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, Ronnie overtook Stephen Hendry, so I think Stephen would still be second and not far off first. I mean, what he did, you know, he took the mantle from Steve. Steve sort of helped build it all up, and then Stephen said, "I'll have some of that." And the thing with him, it's never sort of talked about. We talk about natural talents. He didn't start playing snooker at all until he was 12. He got a small table. It's an old story, really, but the small table for Christmas. I'd never had any interest in snooker before. So he started playing at 12. 4 years later, he was professional. So in those 4 years, he got good enough to turn professional. And then just 4 years after that, pretty much, or 5 years after that, he won the World Championship. The youngest ever winner. That's one record he's still got. Ronnie can't take that from him unless he turns back time. So he was phenomenal, Stephen Hendry. He did it all in a short space of time, basically about 10 years. he won his 7 world titles. He didn't have the longevity of O'Sullivan and Higgins and Mark Williams, but he still did an awful lot in the time that he had. And of course, he did sort of make a comeback, which he didn't really commit to. But he set the standards that those guys growing up were watching. So the Ronnies and the John Higgins, Mark Williams, they'd seen Davis. Now they were seeing Hendry, and of course they got the chance to play him as well, and that helped them improve and push the standards on, which is what happens in sport. People get inspired. You know, Ray Reardon looked up to Joe Davis, Steve Davis looked up to Ray, you know, Hendry looked up to Steve, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and David, I've never been to a live snooker game, although I did see an exhibition at Butlins in 1985. I was looking at
Right.
Jim Meadowcroft, who I'm sure you will remember, was doing an exhibition. That's the only time I've seen snooker kind of in the flesh. What's the difference between watching snooker on the telly and being in one of those high octane arenas, you know, like the Crucible?
Oh, there's a big difference, I think. You really get involved in the tension if you're there live. The Crucible's a good venue to mention because the crowd are so close. The players will say, like, if they're struggling, you know, there might be a couple of old women in the front row. Oh, he's not playing well. And you can hear it all as a player. You know, you've literally got that in your ear. But from the audience perspective, you really get caught up in it. It's a very different vibe. Obviously, at home, there is. I mean, you get the great camera angles and the great coverage, but there is a distance, and you can do other things. You can be on your phone. You can be. If you're in the arena, you're concentrating on it. You're part of the environment. And people talk about over the years, they've talked about, oh, you know, snooker should look at darts and try and jazz itself up. The point is, in snooker, the atmosphere is being quiet. That is what adds to the tension on the players. It's the fact you're in a room full of people. They're not making any noise because they're watching you doing what you're supposed to be doing, or not doing it maybe. And that makes it really exciting. And I know people who've come for the first time and, you know, maybe have not had that much interest in it, and come out, if they've seen a good match, you know, sort of shaking from it, because it is an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, you see these people who are there for the first time. It is look like nothing else, or it feels like it's like nothing else. And talking about the Crucible, David, obviously, during the World Championships, there was lots of discussion about the longevity as the place as the host of the World Championships. Where are we now as we move on a few months? Do you think that conversation is going to go away, or do you realistically see it staying there, or moving somewhere larger?
Well, they'll have to make a decision soon because the contract is up in 2027. So obviously that's only 3 years from now. So I imagine we'll hear soon. I think there's a great emotional tie, obviously, to the Crucible, and there's great merit in keeping it there because every champion since 1977 has won it there. So the venue and the sort of forbidding nature of the venue, the fact it's small actually, which is also what detracts people from wanting to keep it there. The fact it's small is what adds to the tension. There's certain players who proved that actually they can't really stand up to it there. Players who've won a lot of tournaments elsewhere have struggled to win it there. So what it has going for it is that history and that special nature. But we live in obviously a commercial world, and they're looking at it thinking, well, we've only got 1,000 seats. We could surely sell the world final at least 3 times over and make more money. It's not quite as simple as that because they don't pay to hire the Crucible. So every ticket they sell, they're already in profit. There are other venues where they would have to pay to hire. And so it's not as straightforward as just saying, we'll go somewhere bigger. And also earlier on in the championship, certainly week 1, you know, you wouldn't sell out for bog standard first round matches. The fact that they haven't actually left yet suggests that they are still very interested in staying there. I think Barry Hearn in particular, I mean, in 1981, when Steve Davis won, Barry was his manager. Steve wins for the first time, and Barry, he barreled across the stage, nearly knocked him over, fists to the air, seeing, you know, the great achievement and what was to come. And to sort of throw away the opportunity for someone else to do that, even though the World Championship would still be a great event elsewhere, it wouldn't be the same event at the Crucible. And Barry has a very strong emotional tie to Sheffield. So the fact that I think they've sort of, a lot of what's been said in public has been really for the benefit of Sheffield City Council, saying to them, you know, we want a better deal. It's really more for them to hear than anyone else. We'll see. I love the Crucible. I'd be very sad to see it go. So yeah, but we will find out relatively soon, I think.
Yeah. And I was thinking how I could link the Godcast to the the snooker world. I mean, the two don't naturally sit hand in hand, David. But when you talk about the kind of the intimacy of the Crucible, the game is totally global now, isn't it? Joe Perry came on not too long ago and talks about these huge arenas in China and Germany and such like. Have you sensed a cultural shift in the game of snooker and how it's become, like a worldwide competitive sport, like it wasn't perhaps in the early 80s where it was, it was the Four Nations, really, wasn't it? And if so, what does that do culturally to the game and maybe, even spiritually?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely more interest, and that's really television. In the 80s, it was on BBC and ITV in the UK. There wasn't much coverage elsewhere. Eurosport, about 20 years ago, started broadcasting the whole tour, and that goes to 60 countries. They started putting tournaments on in Asia. Chinese television get tens of millions of viewers. So, for example, I mean, we talk about in Britain, Dennis Taylor winning on the black in 1985 against Steve Davis, 18.5 million at midnight, amazing figure. But the world final that Ding was in 2016 against Mark Selby in China got about 200 million, and that was just in China. So that completely dwarfed any figures that had gone before. So I think what we've seen in recent years is new viewers coming to the game, and that's good. They're not obsessed with the nostalgia of the 80s like we might be. Their favourite players are the current players. They love Judd Trump and Ronnie and all the players that play now, Neil Robertson, Mark Selby, so on and so on. I don't think it's necessarily changed the game. In some ways, it's actually preserved traditions, because there's been a lot of talk about clothing, for example, the waistcoats. I mean, who do you really meet in real life who dresses like a snooker player, And people have said it's old-fashioned and it should be moved on. But actually, in China, apparently, they see that sort of traditional British dress as actually something they like, because it's a view of Britain that they maybe have, from the wider culture. So they actually want to keep that. And why not, really? It is associated with the game. So I think, obviously, the more countries we visit, the more the spread of the game. I think actually it's not so much what it does to the culture of snooker. It's what it introduces for the players who travel around the world. They were just in Xi'an recently in China, where the terracotta army is. The players went to see that, broadening their horizons a bit, which they're not always done. It's often just been sort of work, really, playing snooker. They're getting to see parts of the world. They'll be in Saudi Arabia, they'll be in various places, and they get to meet people from these countries and find out what happens in these places. So I think it can only be good. And what it proves again is, for whatever reason, how compelling snooker is. Because, for example, in Germany, there's actually very few places to play. The participation levels are low, but people love to watch. There's a tournament there every year at the Tempodrome in Berlin. It's packed, and they're absolutely wrapped. You very rarely hear a phone go off in Germany. They do the thing of turning it off and just watching the snooker. So it's great that we've been able to sort of export it. And hopefully what will happen is, and it is starting to happen now, we'll get more players from outside Britain. There's a lot of Chinese players already, but this season there's a Hungarian on tour, there's a Latvian, there's a Polish player. They've all seen it on Eurosport. They're all young guys who, as kids, saw it on telly. It's quite difficult, I imagine, in Hungary to find a place to play, but they've come through, and now they're starting their sort of careers.
Yeah, I mean, Eurosport have been a real advocate for the game. Do you think Eurosport gets the credit it warrants?
I don't think it gets enough. The example of Ricky Walden, he won some really big tournaments in China. He won the Shanghai Masters, he won the International Championship. I think the Wuxi Classic was the other one. They were big ranking events with massive first prizes. But for a while, when he was sort of top 16, you would hear on the BBC, on the commentary, people saying, Ricky Walden, he's won tournaments in China, as if they were kind of, well, we're not even going to say what they were just in China. They were actually massive events. And of course, they were shown on Eurosport, so snooker fans could watch them. I think what they've done is incredible, really, because it's very much like in the 80s on British TV, the BBC and ITV. They've just given people a chance to watch it. And it's been interesting to follow that journey. My colleague in Germany, Rolf Kalb, he's a bit of a legend there, because he used to send off for tapes, back in the day when it wasn't on German TV from England. He's been able to educate the viewers about what snooker is, the sort of arcane rules and so on. And there's other commentators around Europe who've done that as well. put it this way: if they ever lost the Eurosport contract, the game would be in serious trouble because there's sort of 14 events there that they show that no one else does.
Yeah, yeah. And we can't talk about snooker without talking about Ronnie. David, I have a love. Well, I wouldn't like to use the word hate relationship, but I have a difficult relationship with Ronnie because, on the one hand, I recognise his genius, but on the other hand, I think you arrogant. Sometimes I think you arrogant so and so. You know, and I'm sure you know him as well as most people on the tour. David, what is he? He looks a complex character. Is there a reality from the myth that we perhaps see on the TV screens? What is the genius of Ronnie O'Sullivan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know him. I don't think anyone really knows him on tour. He keeps himself separate. Um, the first thing to say is he's a one-off talent. It's not just natural genius. He had a table at home when he was growing up. He had opportunities. Top players came to play him to sort of help him develop. But it's clear just watching him, right and left-handed, that there's something special about him. He was plunged into the spotlight at a very young age. He won the UK Championship when he was 17. People know the story that his father was sent down, and he found that difficult. And most people listening to this, well, probably everyone listening to this, won't have gone through that experience and won't know what it would do to you. But what's interesting is he's never broken the link with snooker. In fact, he seems to play more than ever now. So for all the talk that his own love-hate relationship with the game, he still clings to it. It's in his blood. I think with Ronnie, he has to sort of have pain before he has pleasure. If you look at he runs every day, but he doesn't jog. He runs. He goes full pelt, and he's exhausted at the end. But for him, that's the achievement. He's actually putting himself through that. And I think in snooker, it's the same. I think that he almost has to say things that people don't like. He has to almost sort of go to the brink of sabotaging it and then turn it round with some genius on the table. It is complex, but Ronnie wouldn't be Ronnie without all of that. There wouldn't be the fascination in him if he was just good. But you have to have the soap opera. It can be tiresome at times. I think most people feel that. But he always manages to, whatever he's done, put it right on the table. And when you watch him play, you think, wow, that is how you play a sport. And very few people in any sport can reach the levels that he can reach. He's not always at them. And I think that's one of the reasons he gets frustrated, because he knows how good he can be. And most of the time he plays well enough for most people, but not for him. But that's, as I say, that's the sort of theory I have, is that he has to experience pain first before he can have the pleasure.
And do you think he can dominate for as long as he chooses to? I mean, he seems to just get better.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. I think you write him off at your peril, but he will be 50 next year, and the sort of natural aging process, and you can develop aches and pains and all the rest of it. I think he can still win tournaments. I mean, he won 5 last season, so that speaks for itself. But the World Championship is the one, isn't it? He's won it 7 times. How many more of those will he win? Will he win any more? It's impossible to say. I think with him, he's such an enigma. He's not suddenly going to decline completely because he's got a long way to fall. But it's really more a question of whether other players can step up, actually, and not be intimidated by him. I mean, Kyron Wilson, actually, last week in China, he did beat him. He's the world champion, Kyron, and he wasn't intimidated. He wanted to play him on the main table, and obviously wanted to beat him, and he did. Judd Trump did that in Shanghai. He beat him quite comfortably, like 10-3 or something. So it's up to those guys, but not all the top players can do that. They are intimidated by him. If they don't step up, then there's no reason why he can't carry on. Fred Davis, the great Fred Davis, last played at the Crucible when he was 70, right? Now, that would be something, wouldn't it, if Ronnie could match that? But you wouldn't put it past him.
No.
If the Crucible's still going, obviously.
Yeah. And as a 55-year-old priest, I can certainly vouch for the aches and pains that they're well on the way in my body anyway. David, I want to just say a word about refereeing, because Leo Scullion came on the Godcast, and he's a lovely chap, and a lovely chat with him. Just say something a bit about the importance of the roles they do. I mean, they're certainly there to bring order to an event, but maybe the intricacies or the subtle way they control the game that we perhaps don't see on the TV, if you would.
Yeah, it's one of those jobs that it kind of maybe doesn't look much, but it's very important. And the biggest thing is concentration, because you have to watch everything, obviously, and be aware of everything. And, you know, I mean, I couldn't do it because, you know, my mind would wander after about 5 minutes. And of course, the matches can be long, the frames can be long. Sometimes they're not doing that much other than if sort of players on a break, you know, fishing the blackout, putting it back on its spot. Other times they're putting balls back after fouls and obviously have to know every rule. It's amazing how many players don't know a lot of the rules, and the referees are there to sort of clarify them. It's an important role, and also what you need is authority. I mean, the referees of the old days, you know, the Len Ganleys and John Williams, I mean, they were like, you know, almost like sort of club bouncers. They were so sort of in charge, and you didn't mess with them. I think times have changed a little bit, but what's interesting actually about the referees now is, again, there are a lot from Eastern Europe. A lot have come through seeing it on Eurosport, not maybe good enough to play, but wanted to be involved. It's an interest. What's interesting about it, I think, is we never have. I mean, sometimes it happens in cricket and other sports. You never have an ex-player become a referee, and I think the reason is they know how hard it is. They know how hard it is to not only be across everything, but to keep that focus the whole match, however long the match is. There was a frame, famously, Fergal O'Brien and Dave Gilbert, that lasted over 2 hours, the longest ever frame. Now, it was the last frame, so there wasn't going to be another one. But the referee there, Dave Ford, you know, he had to obviously, for the whole, and it was a best of 19. They'd already played 18 frames. He had to, you know, keep going for the whole thing. It's not easy.
Yeah. Well, David, I've loved chatting snooker with you. I really do enjoy the sport. Have you got a busy few weeks, months ahead? How's it all looking for you?
Yeah, it is busy. I've got the Saudi Arabia tournament first, and then they come pretty rapidly. As a rule of thumb, as the weather gets worse, there's more tournaments. As we head into the sort of autumn and winter, the ITV tournaments will come on, and you know, we've got the home nations on Eurosport, and yeah, it's great. I mean, what's been great over the years that I've been working on the circuit is the way it's built up. You know, we've got the established tournaments are still there, a lot of new tournaments. And it's great to see that the interest is still there. And you know, it's quite a simple game in some ways, not to play, but the sort of idea of it is simple. But the complexities that go along with it still fascinate me completely. So yeah, I'm looking forward to what's ahead.
Right. And finally, can you give us a player to look out for this year?
I've got there's a sort of, well, I don't call it a revival, but it's coming around, a player done before called Home Time, which is on, I should know this, but I think in November in London. But hopefully next year. What happened was when the pandemic came along, theatre collapsed, obviously, because there were no shows at all. And some of the things I was working on then kind of went away. So I'm trying to sort of get them going again. So hopefully next year there'll be more. Obviously, got to find the time between all the snooker, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, David, thanks for coming on. I hope everybody's enjoyed this chat about all things snooker. If you do, check out the Godcast. There's lots of sports people on there, including some of the names that we've mentioned in the chat this afternoon. So, David, thank you for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.